Hello, and welcome to the Healing Our Cultural Wounds podcast. I'm Paul Croce. I'm recently retired from 30 plus years of teaching history in academic classrooms at Stetson University. It's in DeLand, Florida, USA. Now I'm applying what I've learned from students and from scholarly research to talk with citizens of all ages about their concerns and their hopes. Mine too. This podcast series has stories from our past and our present about hurts from the ways we disagree. And it provides ways to turn those obstacles into opportunities. Now that may sound like a big task, but I'd just like to take one bite off that apple today. I'm calling today's presentation Varieties of African American Responses to Injustice. And as a historian, I'd like to ask this big question: how does change happen? It's a question that historians like me like to ask, but it's not just a question for the scholar's study. It's worth asking for all of us. Understand change, and you can make things happen better. Now, you don't have to take my word for it. Here's Sam Cooke with his song, A Change Is Gonna Come, from 1965, written during the height of the Civil Rights Movement.
A change gonna come. Oh, yes, it will.
There are lots of things that historians can't do well. Goodness knows. Yes, they're not your go-to people for going to court, for changing a tire, or writing a prescription. But if historians can help you figure out how to steer through the great big court of public opinion and pull towards social change, that might lead to a prescription for a better life. Here's my question for today. What has contributed to African American progress beyond the tragedies of discrimination and injustices? The message from history is that every era contains a great big mix of people and possibilities. I'll present now many examples of African Americans from the 19th century to the present, each suggesting their own paths to progress, paths that are often very different from each other, even producing disagreements. I ask you to listen with me to their stories and their voices. What do you think? Do you hear helping or hindering from each path for the goal of changing American society toward increased justice? Something all of us want. And I'll present this history in 4 parts, 4 phases, when people asked during their own time, can change happen? How about now? How about now? Is this the time when change is going to come? For each of these parts, I'll borrow words from Sam Cooke. Can change happen? And watch for more words from Cooke's song. Starting with part 1, A Long Time Coming. African Americans before the Civil War era longed for freedom. In the 1820s, in the small town of Southampton, Virginia, about 50 miles south of Richmond, and 40 miles west of the coastal city of Norfolk, a man named Nathaniel Turner gained a following among his fellow slaves for his dramatic preaching. Inspired by the biblical book of Exodus and by the American Revolution, at first he planned a rebellion for his fellow slaves on the 4th of July, no less, 1831. Nat Turner's rebellion actually took off that next month, and it led to dozens of slave owners' deaths. And in response, Turner was hung. And as fears of slave rebellion spread throughout Virginia and the rest of the South, hundreds more African Americans were killed at the hands of government officials and informal white mobs. This call for freedom was stopped in its tracks. Other efforts were more successful. For example, Frederick Douglass not only taught himself to read and write, he then freed himself. He also became a successful journalist and an advocate for the abolition of slavery and the rights of African Americans and women. In 1852, he asked, what to the slave is the 4th of July, the Independence Day for American freedom? Although he said, I must mourn about present conditions, he also added, I do not despair of this country. In America, he declared, freedom is within reach, but he pointed out that it will not emerge without effort. Change will only come if enough people will, in his words, agitate, agitate, agitate. Araminta Ross was born a slave and worked as a cook field hand and a nursemaid. After taking the first name of her mother and the last name of her husband, she heard she was about to be sold. So this slave woman, better known as Harriet Tubman, at about the age of 30, ran away in 1849 to Philadelphia. Then she turned around to the South over a dozen times to help at least 70 others gain their freedom too. Realizing the dangers and with fierce determination, she told those who were boarding on her Underground Railroad, "You'll be free or you'll die." Now my part two, ways to carry on. After the war, despite the formal end of slavery in 1865, limits on African American freedom continued. Attention turned to uplift, ways to improve lives in communities often impoverished. Booker T. Washington achieved fame for his own story of uplift at Tuskegee Institute. Then he presented his story, his own story, as a model for the power of personal efforts despite racism, especially in his book called none other than Up from Slavery, whose very title suggested the potential for African Americans to partake in the American dream, in this land of opportunity. Up from oppression, up from poverty, and with Washington as an example, up from slavery. Many whites responded with relief that he did not seek structural change to the racial hierarchy of segregation taking shape in the late 19th century while he was coming of age. He did not ask the nation to make a turn up from racism. In his 1895 speech at the Atlantic Exposition, he did not criticize the very system of segregation, but delicately called it the relation of the races in all things social, with whites and blacks separate as the fingers of our hands. Then he called attention to our common humanity and positive potentials in cooperation, despite differences, saying the races can be one as the hand in all things essential to mutual progress. W.E.B. Du Bois criticized this accommodation to injustices of segregation by pointing out that the personal efforts of Washington that he encouraged did in fact run into the structural impediments of racism after all.
Du Bois helped to establish the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People,
using the language common at the time and still to this day called the NAACP, which worked to break through the legal and cultural structures and the outbursts of violence that hemmed in the lives of non-whites. This work would culminate in the civil rights movement and the overturning of segregation in courts, in laws, and in everyday life, as symbolized by the visionary leadership of Martin Luther King Jr. in the 1950s and 60s. This has been an American triumph, even as it has not fully eclipsed the messages from Tuskegee of Washington. African American potentials and achievements have been overlooked repeatedly from the times of slavery to recent increased integration of the races. It is likely that Dr. William Allen hoped to convey as part of the standards that the Florida Board of Education passed. That's something that the Florida Governor Ron DeSantis has put together and encouraged, as these standards state that slaves developed skills for their own personal benefit. So I think he's channeling some Booker T. Washington there with his message of uplift, while overlooking the Du Bois type of emphasis on rights, which after all were so aggressively rejected in chattel slavery. In Washington's own time, James Wright was an African-American businessman in my own hometown of DeLand, Florida, and Wright owned land and citrus groves and liked to say, also in the spirit of Washington, that people eating his oranges don't know black oranges from white oranges. Rather than petition for rights, he insisted individual hard work and good business practices would enable every American, no matter their race, to succeed. Du Bois and the advocates for civil rights disagreed. Despite Wright's own successes, personally, structures of racial prejudice did hem in many African Americans, no matter how hard they worked. And in fact, despite his impressive achievements, Wright's building went into disrepair. However, now it is being refurbished with hopes to let what's now called Wright's Corner once again serve as a center of African American community in a central Florida town, finally to become integrated with the majority white downtown DeLand. Countless African Americans faced prejudice despite their achievements, even as many achieved despite prejudice. Going back to the 1850s, Philip Reed was a slave. He was owned by a skilled metal worker. His owner, the sculptor Clark Mills, received the commission for the Statue of Freedom atop the U.S. Capitol building, nearing completion in Washington, D.C. Reed, the slave, was responsible for much of the casting, and he is credited with figuring out safely how to hoist the massive statue with a system of pulleys to set each of its 5 parts atop the dome. When completed in December of 1863, during the depths of the Civil War, a 35-gun salute celebrated the glorious sight, the dome of the Capitol, with all 12 forts around the Capitol joining in. Despite the irony of a slave working on a freedom statue, Reed did not earn any of the $23,000 commission, and he could take home only 1 day's payment for each week of his work. Years later, in 1928, Congress gave him, quote, much credit for his faithful and intelligent services, but no back pay. Many African Americans achieved significantly despite the sea of prejudice around them. Some examples from my town in DeLand include Amanda Worthy. She was a DeLand midwife and healthcare provider in the early 20th century. Trained in the School of Experience from the work of senior midwives, she was often the only source of healthcare in the DeLand African American community until 1918, when S.R. Coleman, a Black doctor, opened up his practice. Dr. Coleman added to her medical training, and Worthy not only attended the births of many Black and white babies, but also took care of many seriously ill patients in her own hometown before the segregated Black hospital, which became known as the Burgess Pavilion, opened in 1930. Individual enterprising, as Washington and Wright advocated, and as Worthy practiced, could make some headway to overcome racial assumptions, but that approach would surely run into roadblocks, as Philip Reed experienced, and with violent attacks, the most brutal barrier. African Americans were the chief victims of vigilante lynching, with thousands killed as the chief targets, but while whole communities were left grieving and intimidated. Meanwhile, Du Bois's and King's work for addressing legal structures of cultural assumptions of racial hierarchy could actually benefit from spurs to individual initiative that Washington and Wright championed. In other words, individual enterprising and the quest for rights could work together. Now I turn to my third part, still quoting from Sam Cooke. Still working, just like a river. In the last century, Zora Neale Hurston followed aspects of each of these traditions for individual and for structural change. While she did not challenge segregation directly, she undercut its cultural assumptions by celebrating the great but often overlooked achievements of African Americans, even everyday average citizens. While enjoying meals together with friends on their front porches in her hometown of Eatonville, Florida, one of the first Black towns in the USA, she collected their imaginative stories, what they playfully called swapping lies and murdering groceries. She presented herself as an example of the kinds of Black contributions to American life that she celebrated, declaring boldly about segregation and white dismissals of Black culture. It astonishes me that people would willingly give up the pleasure of my company. Malcolm X turned that spirit of pride into a political goal for not only freedoms within political structures, but also for community self-sufficiency. Learn your history, he told his fellow African Americans, and take pride in who you are. In our time, Marcia Chatelain picks up on that very dual legacy in her book Franchise on the Golden Arches in Black America. She shows how, yes, McDonald's restaurants in African American communities at once provided business opportunities to Black owners of franchises and served as settings for meetings to organize civil rights demonstrations. In our time, two other African American thought leaders present contrasting messages about how to respond to the legacy of racism in the United States. Ibram X. Kendi focuses on the structural legacies of slavery and segregation that circulate in people's prejudices with silent slippages throughout the culture, despite the achievements of the civil rights movement. He seeks to lance the boil of tacit racism by reminding of the tragedies of racial hierarchy and by working toward removing the legacies of demeaning assumptions. By contrast, John McWhorter disagrees with the emphasis on structural racism because it turns attention away from acknowledging large historical changes, positive changes. As he emphasizes, we have moved beyond public acceptance, as he put it, of wanting Black people to stay in their place. And he welcomes individual initiatives by African Americans to address the inequalities we struggle to get past. We can benefit from both of these messages because change happens from a mix of structural and individual steps. Kendi's wake-up calls to move beyond structural racism and McWhorter's calls for personal responsibility could actually support each other if we look at ways their messages address different parts of very complicated lives. Individual efforts are hemmed in by structures of racial assumptions, even as those efforts can help to erode the assumptions. And healthier structures can nurture individuals for making beneficial choices. Just as Kendi and McWhorter each present valuable messages on the paths toward a more just society for all races, so too there can be some hope for listening across our ideological divides. Loretta Ross is a good guide for learning across these differences. She does not hesitate to call people out for racist comments, racist policies, or racial assumptions. Yes. But she does not stop there with criticism. She also raises hopes for what she calls calling people in, to encourage learning across and even persuade across differences. This can widen the array of support for addressing the legacies of injustice. Recruit people, draw them in, call them in, as she puts it. In her stance, Ross exhibits a contemporary expression of what American psychologist and philosopher William James a century ago called moving past a certain blindness that most of us harbor about the interior lives of our fellow human beings. Think about it. How much do we know our fellows? We can never become them. We can never fully understand them. But we can take steps past our islands of satisfaction past our islands of blindness, with seeing the world only from our own point of view. Possible. It's within reach. And for that purpose, I turn to my fourth and last part. Now I'm going to quote a different leader, Martin Luther King Jr. I call this part the sword that heals. Think about it. Visiting the world of our fellow citizens in reading, in the arts, in our imagination, in person, in conversation, visiting at a store, visiting in the library, visiting with others' neighborhoods, can also become ways to understand parts of ourselves. Up to now, those parts have been hidden in the souls of our fellow citizens. From this perspective of trying to learn, we can actually meet people of different races, of different ethnicities, of different genders, of different national origins, of different religions, of different political ideologies, and say, oh, so those are some other ways of being human in this challenging world. Then those differences can become resources for dealing with our own challenges, which you know are going to come. The complicated whole is beyond any one of us, even as each of us can supply some perspective, some insights, some talents for coping better and even for thriving. That means growing better from listening to the next guy, and maybe that person could benefit from what we have to offer too. Listening across differences, Washington and Du Bois, of Hurston and Ross, of McWhorter and Kendi, can provide ways to strengthen us as individuals and as parts of structures that each individual inhabits. The structures were made by people, and they can be improved, even as they can also get worse. So better to catch that first train, don't you think? The one moving toward improvement. Those individual efforts can bring uplift on tomorrow's test in school, this month's reconciliation with a hostile neighbor, or next year's possible promotion, even as each individual is part of bigger structures. Each of our lives brings on small but important fractions of all the changes afoot. With enough connection to our fellows, each individual action can shape the direction of the structure. Well, just a little bit. Individually, we can't change the world. No. But when our efforts connect with others, potentials for change get a boost. And here's why I'm quoting from Martin Luther King. He famously delivered the I Have a Dream speech in 1963, August of 63. It is justly famous. But changes need more than dreams to make things happen. He knew that. And a year after that inspirational speech, King delivered a message less well known, providing some gritty action steps. He called his essay, The Sword That Heals. What? Sword that heals, to bring together the fierceness of fighting with the constructive power of nonviolence. What? A sword that heals? A sword of peace? A sword that's not destructive? Peace, but not passive? What's with that? He enlisted parts of our world and parts of our thinking, usually set in contrast, swords and healing. The sword that heals begins with, as he put it, rejecting concepts of inferiority. First, you have to reject in yourself that you are inferior. It steps from individual feelings like that to society with a fighting spirit, as he put it, demanding rights as citizens. It endures through the work of courts and the halls of government, and through the fires of turmoil, as he put it, and even through temporary setbacks, hampering every human effort, which are going to happen. The sword that heals is, as he put it, a moral force that can motivate change and serve as an example to the whole world. Now I'm going to end really full circle back where I began with Sam Cooke's A Change Is Going to Come. But I'll tweak his lines. It's been a long time coming. Yes. A change is going to come.
Could be, but it's not a sure bet.
However, if we work on it with different people, each with their own outlooks, their own talents, their own approaches, we can each give change a nudge. That's a question for any one of us. What's your nudge?
This podcast from the Public Classroom series, Healing Our Cultural Wounds, Episode 2, Varieties of African American Responses to Injustice, is a collaboration of Stetson University and Texas A&M University, and it is dedicated to tapping insights and stories from the past to encourage listening across cultural differences today.
The individual is a public classroom in their institutions.
Paul Croce, Devin Hernandez, Batista, and Mathias Haugner formerly worked at Stetson University.
And Patrick Grigsby works at Texas A&M. Stay tuned for future essays and podcasts providing context to help you learn across differences. Thanks for joining the task of healing our cultural wounds.